Imagine this. You open your door to a man in need. He's homeless, vulnerable, looking for a place to stay, someone to offer him shelter. You, a 75-year-old man, decide to take him in, offering him food, warmth, a place to sleep. You never think twice because it's the right thing to do. 3 months go by and this stranger has settled into your life. He's quiet, keeps to himself, and seems grateful for your kindness. But what you don't know is that behind those grateful eyes, something far darker is hidden. Something no one could have prepared you for. One day, the unimaginable happens. The kindness you extended turns into a nightmare you couldn't have seen coming. This stranger, the one you thought you were helping, becomes your final nightmare. What was it about him? Was it a lie, a facade? Or was he always destined to do what he did? As the truth unravels, we discover that in the end, this man wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He was the true danger. This is the story of a 75-year-old man whose simple act of compassion sealed his fate. It's a story that forces us to confront the idea. How well do we really know the people we let into our lives? Stay with us, because the truth behind this unimaginable act is not just about a hidden killer. It's about how far we'll go to trust, and how easily that trust can be shattered. It was a small town, nestled in the heart of America, a place where everyone knew everyone else, and the rhythm of life moved at a slower pace. A town called Riverside, a name that carried with it the kind of simplicity and serenity you'd expect from a community where people still wave to their neighbors on the street and where the pace of life seemed to exist in a comfortable harmony. Riverside wasn't a large town, but it was home to a close-knit community that had grown up alongside each other. It had that familiar old-world charm, with tree-lined streets, modest houses, and small businesses lining the main road. People here were grounded, rooted in a shared history that extended back generations. It was a place where stories passed down from one family to the next still held weight. In a world that was rapidly changing with the onset of technology and the rise of social media, Riverside seemed like a retreat, a place where things moved at their own pace, untouched by the chaos of modern life. Or so it seemed. In the heart of this town, there lived a man named Harold. He was 75, a retired school teacher, and a fixture in Riverside. Everyone knew Harold, his soft-spoken demeanor, his gentle smile, and the way he'd stop to talk with anyone who crossed his path. His house, located just at the end of Maple Street, was modest but well cared for, with a small garden in the front and a porch that Harold could often be found sitting on in the late afternoon, sipping his iced tea and reading the newspaper. Harold was the kind of person who would greet you by name, remember the details of your life, and offer help when you least expected it. He had lived in Riverside for nearly 50 years, and his kindness had become a cornerstone of his character. He was the first to offer a hand to someone in need, whether it was a neighbor who needed help moving furniture, a troubled teenager who needed someone to talk to, or a newcomer who needed a place to stay. Harold was the embodiment of the idea that helping others was the right thing to do, no matter the cost. It was that very kindness, that willingness to extend a helping hand, that would lead him down a path he never could have foreseen. On a chilly November afternoon, Daniel came into his life. Daniel was in his mid-30s. He was a man with no fixed address, no job, no prospects. He had lost everything in the chaos of his own life. His family, his home, his dignity. His face, weathered by the harshness of the world, told a story of pain, of hardship. He had wandered into Riverside, a town that seemed to offer the promise of a fresh start. Daniel hadn't planned on staying long. He thought maybe he could find a job, scrape together a few dollars, and move on. But when he crossed paths with Harold in the local diner, things changed. Harold had noticed him right away. His tired eyes, the threadbare clothes that didn't quite fit the season. The way he sat hunched over, almost trying to disappear into the corner. It wasn't unusual to see people passing through town looking for work. But something about Daniel struck Harold, and without hesitation, he invited him to his home. It was nothing out of the ordinary for Harold. He had taken in strangers before, offering them a roof over their head until they could get back on their feet. A small act of kindness. That's all it seemed to be. But as soon as Daniel stepped into Harold's house, something shifted in the air. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Daniel was quiet, respectful, but there was something about the way he moved, the way he held himself, that made Harold uneasy. Still, Harold was the kind of man who trusted people. He had to be. It was how he lived. So he offered Daniel a place to stay for the night. Then, one night turned into two into a week, and then a week into a month. By the time the second month rolled around, Daniel had become a regular presence in Harold's home. He helped around the house, cooked meals, and even began doing some light repairs in the yard. He was polite, even helpful at times, and Harold had to admit he was grateful for the company. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when Harold couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about Daniel. It wasn't anything he could quite put his finger on. There was no obvious sign of trouble. Daniel was well-mannered, always on his best behavior. But there were those little things. The way he would disappear during the day, returning only when the sun began to set. The strange look he'd sometimes get in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. The way he had started spending more and more time alone in the house, while Harold was out running errands or meeting with old friends. Harold tried to brush it off. After all, it was just a feeling, a nagging suspicion. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just his age catching up with him, making him more paranoid than usual. But something about Daniel didn't sit right with Harold, even if he didn't know exactly what it was. Still, Harold was a man who believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. He had seen enough hardship in his life to know that everyone deserved a second chance, or even a third or fourth. But as the days turned into weeks, Harold began to feel something else creeping in. A sense of unease, a realization that maybe, just maybe, he had misjudged this situation. Maybe Daniel wasn't the victim he appeared to be. Maybe he had let someone into his home who had far darker intentions than anyone could have guessed. And so, as the days passed and the chill of winter settled over Riverside, the question hung in the air. Had Harold made a mistake? Had he allowed a stranger, a man who had nothing, to take refuge in his home without ever questioning who he really was? Could he have missed something? Could he have been too trusting, too kind, in a world where kindness could sometimes be the very thing that leads to destruction? For now, Harold continued to believe in the good in people, clinging to the hope that his judgment hadn't failed him. But as he sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, there was a part of him, deep down, that began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. And that, dear viewer, is where our story begins. A story not just about a man and a stranger, but about the consequences of trust in a world where you can never truly know what lies beneath the surface. It was November 10th, 2022, when Harold first met Daniel. A crisp, cold evening that marked the beginning of a strange, unsettling chapter in Harold's quiet life. The early fall had already given way to the bite of winter, the kind that seeped into your bones. Harold had invited him into his modest, one-story home without hesitation. The warmth of the fireplace flickered, a pot of stew sat on the stove, and the sounds of the evening news filled the background as Harold went about his routine. Daniel, quiet and reserved, accepted Harold's kindness without question. For the first time in a long while, Harold didn't feel the weight of his own loneliness. Perhaps, he thought, this was a chance to do something good. The following days, as November turned into December, Daniel kept to himself. He didn't ask for much. just a meal, a bed, and the occasional conversation. Harold was content with the quiet routine they had established. There was something comforting about knowing he had someone in the house again. And Daniel seemed grateful, never making any demands, never imposing. He washed the dishes, took out the trash, and even offered to help with yard work. It was the kind of arrangement that worked for both men. Daniel, with his quiet manner, seemed to want nothing more than to escape the harsh cold of the streets. By the end of December, Harold had grown accustomed to Daniel's presence. They exchanged small talk over meals, but nothing more. It was clear that Daniel had a past he wasn't eager to share, and Harold, respectful as ever, didn't press. What mattered was that he had a guest, and for the first time in a while, his house felt like home again. But as the new year arrived, something began to change. Slowly at first, like a shadow crossing over a sunny day. Daniel started to leave the house more frequently, staying out longer and longer. Harold didn't mind at first. Perhaps Daniel needed time to himself. But when Daniel's absences began stretching into the late hours of the night, Harold's concern started to grow. On January 15th, 2023, Daniel came home at nearly 3 a.m., something that struck Harold as odd. Daniel, typically punctual about returning home, slipped through the door almost unnoticed. His clothes were disheveled and his face was unshaven, nothing too unusual, but there was something in his eyes that Harold couldn't ignore. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something harder to place, something cold. The next day, Harold tried to shake off the unease. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe Daniel had just had a long night. But as the days passed, Daniel's behavior grew more erratic. He started to avoid eye contact, mumbling responses when Harold tried to make conversation. Harold chalked it up to the stress of living in someone else's house. But deep down, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the late arrivals or the detached conversations. It was the small things. The way Daniel sometimes looked at Harold, his gaze lingering a little too long, his posture a little too stiff. The way he'd walk around the house at odd hours, pacing silently in the kitchen or standing at the window, staring out into the night with no clear purpose. The unspoken tension was palpable. Still, Harold dismissed it. He had offered kindness, and that was all he could do. He trusted Daniel. But by February 1st, 2023, the growing tension couldn't be ignored any longer. Harold found himself questioning whether he truly knew the man he had welcomed into his home. Daniel had returned from one of his long, unexplained outings on the evening of January 30th, looking even more disheveled than usual. His hands were shaking, his eyes darting nervously as he stepped through the door. Harold, who had seen enough of life's hardships to know when something was off, finally asked what had been on his mind for weeks. "Where have you been, Daniel?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Daniel froze, his eyes meeting Harold's for the first time in what felt like months. A long pause followed, broken only by the sound of the wind howling outside. Then, in a voice far too calm for the situation, Daniel replied, "Just out, getting some fresh air." It was then that Harold knew. Something had shifted. Something had changed in Daniel. As February 2023 continued, Harold's suspicions grew. The man he had welcomed into his home, the man he had trusted, had become a stranger in his own house. But what could Harold do? He couldn't throw Daniel out. He had already given him a roof over his head, and the thought of doing anything less seemed cruel. Yet, as February 14th approached, Harold couldn't escape the growing feeling of danger that loomed over their once peaceful home. Daniel's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was gone for longer stretches of time, and when he returned, he appeared almost different. The warmth that once radiated from him had disappeared, replaced by a coldness that Harold couldn't explain. He kept to his room more often, only coming out to eat in silence or to stare out of the window, never meeting Harold's gaze. By mid-February, Harold was beginning to feel a deep sense of dread, something that had been growing for weeks, unnoticed at first, but now unmistakable. The stranger he had invited into his home wasn't just a homeless man. He was something more, something far more unsettling. And yet, Harold could not bring himself to act. The kindness he had shown Daniel was a commitment, and he couldn't just walk away. But how long could he ignore the signs? How long before everything he had worked for, everything he had built in his life, came crashing down? Harold was about to find out. It was March 15th, 2023, when Harold's unease grew more tangible. For the first time since Daniel had arrived, something in the house felt different, unsettling in a way Harold couldn't fully explain. The air had changed, as if a quiet weight was pressing down on the rooms, invisible but undeniable. It wasn't just the late arrivals or the hollow stares. It wasn't the uneaten meals left sitting at the table or the odd silence that hung in the air when Daniel came home from his late-night walks. It was more than that. The first real indication something was amiss came one morning. Harold had awoken early, as he often did, before the sun had risen fully, the soft sound of the clock ticking beside his bed filling the silence. He stretched, letting the warmth of the blankets cling to him for just a moment before he got out of bed. It was the beginning of another quiet day in his small home. He shuffled into the kitchen, hoping to start the pot of coffee that had become his morning ritual. As Harold made his way through the dark house, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. The door to Daniel's room was slightly ajar, and through the crack, he could see Daniel sitting on the edge of the bed, his back hunched, his head bowed low. Harold stood there for a moment, unsure if he should speak up or just let the silence hang in the air. There was something strange about the way Daniel was sitting, as if he were waiting for something, or someone. The air felt heavy in that space. Harold stepped forward, his footsteps quiet on the old wooden floor, but as he approached the door, something made him hesitate. The floorboards creaked slightly under his weight, and Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes meeting Harold's in an instant. For a split second, there was something in Daniel's expression, something cold, something distant, that made Harold's stomach tighten. But just as quickly, it was gone. Daniel's face softened, his shoulders straightened, and he smiled. "Morning," he said in his usual soft, distant tone. Harold blinked, unsure of what he'd just seen. Was it just his imagination? The weight of the moment seemed to lift, and Harold nodded, though there was an uneasy feeling gnawing at him now. He forced a smile, trying to brush off the oddness of the moment. But that small, fleeting exchange, the tension, the suddenness of Daniel's reaction, had left a mark. That morning, Harold decided to let it go. He didn't want to be paranoid. Daniel was a guest in his home, and Harold had promised to be kind. What harm could a quiet moment of reflection in his room possibly mean? But as the days passed, more small things began to stand out. Little oddities that, on their own, might not have seemed important. But together, they added to the growing sense that something wasn't right. One evening, a few days after that strange encounter, Harold was sitting in the living room, reading the newspaper, when he heard a noise, a strange, muffled thump coming from down the hall. It was subtle at first, just a soft thud like something falling. Harold froze, looking up from the paper, his eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The sound came again. Thud, thud. Harold stood up slowly, his heart beginning to beat a little faster as he walked cautiously toward the source of the sound. The hallway stretched out before him, and the floor creaked under his feet as he moved. When he reached Daniel's room, the door was shut tight. He knocked lightly, calling out, "Daniel? You all right in there?" There was no response. He knocked again, this time louder. "Daniel?" Still no answer. A cold feeling began to settle over Harold, but he couldn't bring himself to open the door. What if Daniel was just lost in thought? What if he was asleep? Harold paused, hesitated, and then stepped back, retreating toward the living room. He couldn't shake the strange sense that he had just narrowly avoided something that felt wrong. But what? He couldn't place it. Maybe it was nothing. Just the weight of living with someone new in his home. It could have been anything. But Harold couldn't escape the feeling that it was more than that. Then, the following week, another incident. This time more pronounced, more obvious. Harold had returned home from a trip to the grocery store, bags of food in hand. The house was still, just as it had been when he left, but as he stepped into the kitchen, he noticed something odd. A small, dark stain on the floor, right near the doorway. He froze, staring at it, unsure of what it was. It wasn't there earlier. He would have noticed it. He bent down to get a closer look. It was dark, almost black. He reached out, touched it with his fingertip, and immediately recoiled. It was wet, fresh. At that moment, Harold's thoughts raced. He stood up quickly, his head spinning. He looked toward Daniel's room, but then stopped himself. What could he possibly say? What if Daniel had spilled something, or it was some sort of mistake? But as the day went on, Harold couldn't get the image of the stain out of his mind. Something about it felt deliberate, as though it were placed there. That evening, Harold confronted Daniel. He tried to keep his tone light, to brush it off as if it were nothing, but the words hung heavy between them. "Daniel," Harold said, his voice shaking slightly, "do you know anything about the mark in the kitchen, the stain?" Daniel paused for a long moment, looking at Harold with a blank expression. Then finally, he spoke. "No," he said flatly, his voice soft but firm. "I don't know anything about it." Harold studied his face, searching for any sign of discomfort, any twitch of an eye, any hint of deceit. But there was nothing. Daniel's face remained expressionless. Harold nodded, forcing a smile. "Okay," he said, but something in his gut told him that wasn't the truth. Something wasn't adding up. The following days passed, but the nagging feeling in Harold's mind didn't go away. The quiet, unsettling oddities, the late-night disappearances, the strange silences, were all adding up in ways that made Harold's skin crawl. But he couldn't bring himself to confront Daniel directly. He had invited him into his home. He couldn't just turn him away. But deep down, Harold knew something was wrong. He just didn't know how wrong. And then, just when Harold thought he might be imagining things, something happened that would change everything. But was this just a moment of paranoia or something far darker? Could the homeless man have been hiding something all along? It started as a quiet, ordinary morning when Mrs. Jenkins, a longtime neighbor of Harold's, became concerned. She hadn't seen him around for days, which was odd. Harold was always out in the mornings, tending to his garden or walking to the store. But now, there was only silence from his house. The blinds had been closed for several days, the mail piling up on the front porch. When she knocked on his door, there was no answer. She knocked again, harder this time, but nothing. Her anxiety grew, and with a sense of unease, she decided to take a walk around the house. As she peered through the windows, something caught her eye. A strange, dark spot on the floor inside, and what looked like a trail leading toward the back of the house. It was then that she knew something was wrong, something she couldn't quite place, but she felt it deeply. Mrs. Jenkins didn't hesitate. She quickly called the police, her voice trembling. Within moments, the sounds of sirens filled the neighborhood, drawing attention as the officers arrived. The sense of dread that had been growing in her chest now seemed to wrap around the entire block. Inside Harold's home, the officers were careful at first, unsure of what they'd find, but what they encountered when they opened the door shocked them to their core. Harold's house, once a comfortable haven, was now a scene of unfathomable violence. The living room was disarrayed, the furniture overturned, and there was an unmistakable blood trail leading into the back room. The officers found Harold's body there, dismembered, the mutilation so precise it seemed almost intentional. It wasn't just a murder, it was an execution, the remains arranged in a manner that was disturbingly methodical. As the investigators processed the scene, the realization began to settle in. This wasn't a random act of violence. The brutality of it, the deliberate nature of the crime, pointed to something much more terrifying. A serial killer. The gruesome dismemberment of Harold's body seemed far beyond the capabilities of an ordinary person, and the police started to suspect that the killer was someone who had been lurking in the shadows for some time. The neighbors were interviewed, and some started to talk about Harold's recent decision to take in a homeless man. Mrs. Jenkins and others recalled seeing the stranger around the neighborhood. At first, they had assumed Harold was just helping out, giving the man a place to stay. But there was something about the man that unsettled them. He never seemed fully present, always distant, always watching. Some of them remarked how they'd never seen him engage with anyone except Harold, never seen him smile or interact as a normal person might. He kept to himself, and in the short time he had been living with Harold, the tension in the air seemed to grow. The police quickly began questioning the neighbors. No one seemed to know much about the man. No one knew his name, where he came from, or why Harold had brought him in. There was no record of him, no history in the town. The officers began to grow suspicious. Was this stranger the one who had committed the crime? Still, something didn't add up. The police had been tracking a serial killer for months. Someone who was methodical, careful, and always left behind a certain pattern. But did this homeless man fit that pattern? As the investigation deepened, the police circulated a picture of Daniel Walters, a man they had been hunting for months, known for a series of horrific killings that spanned several states. The question on everyone's mind was now simple. Was the homeless man who lived with Harold, the one who had been so distant, the same person? The officer, holding up the mugshot, asked the neighbors, "Do you recognize this man?" The neighbors exchanged glances. Some shook their heads in uncertainty. They had seen the man, yes, but he had always appeared unremarkable. How could this be the same person who had committed such gruesome acts? "Well, he did look a bit like him," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice quivering. "But the man we saw, he was just quiet. Never really talked to anyone. Harold was kind enough to let him stay, but I never thought he could be capable of something like this." Others joined in, expressing similar doubts. "Are you sure?" one of the neighbors asked. "He was always so normal when he was around here. I mean, he wasn't talkative, but he wasn't violent, was he?" The police were equally puzzled. They had evidence suggesting the homeless man was connected to the crime, but how could they be sure? No one had seen him act in any way that could have pointed to his involvement in such brutality. It felt like a puzzle with pieces that just didn't fit. "Could he really be the killer?" one officer asked another under his breath. "We've been looking for him for so long, and this guy doesn't seem like him at all." Despite the mounting suspicion, there was still a part of the investigation that didn't make sense. Why would Daniel Walters, if it were him, stay in Harold's home for months without ever raising suspicion? Why would he go so far as to dismember Harold, someone who had helped him? It didn't fit with the profile of a serial killer who had carefully covered his tracks in the past. Questions swirled. If the homeless man had been Daniel Walters all along, how had he managed to live undetected for so long? How had he fooled everyone into thinking he was just another down-on-his-luck stranger? And if he wasn't the killer, then who was? The police began to investigate further into the homeless man's past, questioning everyone who might have known him. But the more they searched, the more unclear the situation became. No one knew the full truth about who he was or where he had come from. Was the man they had been living among all this time truly the killer? Or was there someone else? Someone even more elusive, someone they had missed? The mystery deepened with every answer they uncovered, but for now, one thing was certain. The killer was still out there, hiding in plain sight. With so many unanswered questions, the investigation hung in the balance. Was the homeless man Daniel Walters, or was he merely another pawn in a much larger, more complex game? And if he was the killer, how had he gotten away with it for so long? The police didn't know who to trust or what to believe. All they knew was this: someone had murdered Harold. And whoever it was, they had managed to stay hidden far longer than anyone could have imagined. The discovery of Harold's body sent shockwaves through the community. But as the investigation unfolded, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The police, sifting through old records and connecting dots, slowly realized this wasn't an isolated incident. What they had thought was a random act of violence now seemed like part of something much darker, something systematic and calculated. It wasn't until a deeper look at the homeless man, whom the neighbors had seen around Harold's house, was conducted, that the detectives began to piece together the puzzle. His name, as it turned out, was Daniel Walters. He wasn't just a random drifter. He was someone with a history that had gone unnoticed, buried under layers of false identities and disappearances. The pattern was chilling. Daniel Walters had made a habit of staying with his victims before striking. He'd find someone who was isolated, someone willing to take him in, perhaps even offer him refuge. At first, he would blend in, a quiet figure who could easily go unnoticed in a bustling neighborhood. He'd charm his hosts, ingratiate himself with them, and over time, they'd come to trust him. It was only after a few weeks, sometimes months, that his true nature would reveal itself. Harold had been his latest target, but he wasn't the first. There had been others, victims who had opened their doors to a man they thought was in need. Just like Harold, they had no reason to suspect the true danger lying behind the man's eyes. No reason to think that their kindness would be repaid with death. As the investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a chilling history. It turned out that Daniel Walters had lived in multiple cities across the country, always finding new victims to prey upon. He had been evading the authorities for years, changing his identity each time he slipped away. The police began to realize they had missed him before. He was a ghost, blending in, leaving no trace until it was too late. The details of the previous murders started to surface, and it was clear now. The killings had always followed a similar pattern. The victims were isolated individuals, people who would not be missed by society, and each of them had been killed in a disturbingly methodical way. They had all been taken in, trusted him, and then, without warning, they were gone. The gruesome nature of the crimes was always the same: dismemberment, meticulous arrangements of the body, a deliberate display of control. It was as if Daniel Walters had carefully crafted his own version of an invisible war, using his victims as pawns in a game only he understood. But what was his motive? Was it simply the thrill of the kill? Or was there something deeper, something darker that drove him to this gruesome behavior? The police struggled to understand. They began to question those who had known him, trying to find any clue that might explain what he was after. The more they dug, the more they realized that the killer had never been after money or revenge or even the satisfaction of terrorizing his victims. It was something else, something elusive, something only he understood. As investigators reviewed the case files, they noticed something even more disturbing. Daniel had never stayed in one place for too long. Each time a murder was committed, he would disappear without a trace, only to resurface somewhere else, in a new town, in a new identity. The neighbors who had initially seen him as just another transient now realized the truth. They had been living alongside a killer, and none of them had suspected a thing. The detectives began to put the pieces together. The victims were always carefully chosen, and there was a clear, methodical approach to his actions. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was careful, precise, and cold. The unsettling realization started to take root. Daniel Walters had been living in plain sight, moving unnoticed through the world, leaving behind no clues, no trail, until it was too late. And then came the most chilling discovery. In one of the old police reports, they found a mention of a similar case from years ago, a murder in a small town hundreds of miles away, where the details mirrored those in Harold's case. The victim, too, had been a kind-hearted person who had taken in a stranger, a homeless man who had eventually become the one to end their life. The investigators now saw the pattern more clearly than ever before. This was no random act of violence. This was the work of someone who had been perfecting his method, learning from each murder and adapting his approach to avoid detection. This was not the first time, and it was clear now that it might not be the last. The chilling realization dawned on the investigators that the killer was still out there, and they had to act quickly to stop him before he could strike again. With each new piece of evidence, the police grew more anxious. The killer was closer than they realized, hidden in plain sight. They now understood that they were dealing with someone who had a knack for blending in, someone who knew exactly how to make himself invisible. The question that haunted them was not whether he would kill again, but when and where he would do it. As the detectives delved deeper into the investigation, they discovered that Daniel Walters had left more than just a trail of bodies behind him. He had been meticulously crafting his persona, hiding in plain sight, and in every town he'd visited, there had been someone, a family, a friend, a neighbor, who had trusted him, taken him in, just as Harold had. The pattern was undeniable. Daniel Walters had a history of using people's kindness against them, and it had worked every single time. But why? What was he after? The investigators could find no discernible motive, no deeper psychological reason for his actions. The more they questioned, the more they realized that they were not just dealing with a killer. They were dealing with a man who had no real reason for what he did, except perhaps for the sheer need to exert power and control. The detectives now faced the reality that they had been overlooking a critical detail. The killer wasn't just targeting people at random. He was following a precise pattern, one that had been happening under their noses, right in front of their eyes. And so, the mystery deepened. How long had Daniel Walters been hiding in plain sight? How long had he been living among the very people he would eventually turn on? The detectives were left with more questions than answers, and time was running out. Could they catch him before he disappeared again? Or would the pattern continue, the killer slipping through their fingers once more? The answers, it seemed, were closer than anyone realized, but so was the danger. And with each passing moment, the clock was ticking. The manhunt had reached its climax. After months of painstaking investigation, false leads, and dead ends, the authorities were finally closing in on their target. Daniel Walters had slipped through their fingers time and time again, but now, with his meticulous pattern finally exposed, they knew where he would strike next. The police had a plan, a carefully coordinated sting operation that would bring him to justice. For weeks, detectives had been following the threads of Walters's trail. He had become increasingly bold, not hiding his tracks as well as he once did. Perhaps, they thought, he was growing overconfident. Or maybe, just maybe, he was getting careless, thinking that he had finally outsmarted the law. The investigation had grown intense, and the pressure was mounting. This wasn't just about catching a killer anymore. It was about stopping him before more lives were taken. The night of the operation arrived with a cold, sharp urgency. The detectives had gathered in a safe house, watching their monitors as the hours ticked by. They had traced Daniel's movements to a small town several miles away from his last known location. He had been seen near a dilapidated house on the outskirts of town, an area so isolated that it seemed like the perfect place for him to lie low, hidden from prying eyes. It was there that they had set their trap. The sting was set into motion with precision. Uniformed officers, plainclothes detectives, and K-9 units had positioned themselves, forming a tight perimeter around the area. The quiet buzz of radio communications and hushed voices filled the air, the tension palpable. Everyone knew that this was their last chance. If they didn't catch him now, Walters would slip through again, and who knew how long it would be before he killed again. Minutes felt like hours as the team waited for any sign of movement. Finally, the moment came. A figure emerged from the shadows, walking cautiously toward the house. The detectives didn't need to see his face to know it was him. They had studied his every move, every habit. This was Daniel Walters. As he stepped into the yard, the police swarmed in, their lights flashing, their commands loud and sharp. Walters froze, his expression unreadable, but there was no doubt he knew what was happening. He had been caught. For a brief moment, there was silence. The sound of the sirens pierced the night, and the tension hung thick in the air. Walters didn't resist. He didn't run. He didn't fight. His capture was almost anticlimactic, considering the length of the investigation. As the officers approached, they took him into custody without incident. His face remained unreadable, almost as if he had been expecting this moment. Was it a surrender, or was he simply numb to the inevitability? The investigators quickly secured him, ensuring that no escape routes were left open. Walters had become a ghost for years, slipping between identities, blending in with the crowds. But tonight, he was finally revealed. And yet, the detectives could not shake the feeling that something about this moment didn't add up. Was he truly caught by surprise? Or had he been playing a different game all along? The arrest was the culmination of months of hard work, of following leads that seemed to vanish into thin air, of piecing together a puzzle that had no clear picture until now. But as the officers transported him to the station, the mystery only deepened. Walters' arrest was only the beginning. The investigation had revealed only a fraction of the horror he had caused, and now the detectives had to face the question that had haunted them from the start. Was this really the end of Daniel Walters' killing spree? Or was it merely the beginning of an even darker story yet to unfold? As Walters was escorted into the interrogation room, the investigators began to realize just how much they still didn't know. What had driven him to kill? How had he managed to evade capture for so long? And most chilling of all, what secrets lay hidden beneath the surface of the man they had just arrested? Was he just the tip of the iceberg? The emotional toll of the case could be felt in every corner of the investigation. The family of Harold, the 75-year-old victim, had endured months of grief and uncertainty. They had lived in a state of limbo, wondering if they would ever get justice for their loved one. And now, as the killer was finally in custody, there was a sense of relief, but also a deep sadness that would never fully be erased. They had lost someone they loved, and no arrest could bring him back. But perhaps with Walter's capture, they could finally find some peace, knowing that he would never harm anyone again. For the law enforcement officers involved, the case had taken a heavy toll as well. The hours spent following Walters' every move, the countless interviews with witnesses, the endless paperwork, and the constant threat of him slipping away had left their mark. But in the end, it was the satisfaction of knowing they had caught him, that they had stopped him before more lives were lost, that gave them some measure of solace. And yet, even as they prepared to charge him with the murders, there was a nagging feeling that they had only uncovered the surface of something far more complex, something that might be much bigger than anyone could have imagined. As the final moments of the sting operation played out, the detectives gathered to review the case. Walters was in custody, and the investigation was shifting to the next phase, the interrogation. But there was no sense of victory. There was no celebration. There was only the grim realization that the full scope of this man's actions was still unknown. How many more victims had there been? How many had he left behind, quietly slipping into the shadows as he moved on to the next town, to the next life? And as the interrogators sat down with Walters, a chilling thought crossed their minds. What if this killer's story wasn't just about the murders he had committed? What if, behind the carefully constructed facade of Daniel Walters, there was something far darker waiting to be uncovered? The answers lay ahead, but the detectives were about to learn that this was no simple case of a serial killer caught and contained. There was far more to this story, and it was only just beginning. As the investigation drew to a close and the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, the true horror of Daniel Walters' actions became apparent. The authorities had learned much about the man they had arrested, but the deeper they looked, the more unsettling the revelations became. He had been hiding in plain sight for years, weaving a web of deceit and manipulation, and his victims, those who had trusted him, never saw it coming. At first, Walters appeared to be a harmless, down-on-his-luck homeless man, wandering from place to place, barely noticed in the hustle and bustle of everyday life. But as the detectives pieced together his history, a darker truth began to emerge. His pattern of targeting those who were vulnerable, those who took him in, seemed random at first, just another case of a transient moving from one home to the next. But it wasn't random at all. The detectives discovered that Walters had carefully chosen his victims, not out of rage or random violence, but out of a deep, unsettling need, an insatiable craving that drove him to destroy. It became clear that there was something far more methodical at play. He didn't kill out of necessity. He killed out of a need to dominate, to manipulate, to control. His victims were mere pawns in a twisted game, each one serving a purpose in his carefully constructed plan. It was soon revealed that Walters had a history of psychiatric issues, a trail of instability that stretched back years. But despite numerous brushes with the law and the mental health system, no one had connected the dots. His behavior was erratic, yes, but it was never enough to raise the alarm. He knew how to blend in, how to play the part of a harmless, pitiful figure. He wasn't a monster to those who met him, not at first. But beneath that facade, there was a darkness that only revealed itself once it was too late. His motives, if they could even be called that, were a complex web of revenge, deep-rooted bitterness, and a twisted need for satisfaction that could never be fulfilled. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to break his victims, to make them feel his power over them before he took their lives. His killing wasn't driven by any one thing, it was driven by an emptiness inside him, a gaping hole that nothing could fill. And then, the final twist. In a chilling revelation, it came to light that Walters had been targeting people who had, in some way, tried to help him, offering shelter, food, or just a kind word. But in his mind, their kindness wasn't just a gift, it was a betrayal. They had tried to change him, to offer him something he had never known, and in his disturbed state, that was unforgivable. Each victim represented a failure in his eyes, a reminder that he was beyond saving, beyond help. The kindness of his victims only fueled his resentment, pushing him to strike. The case took on a darker tone as the detectives realized that this was not a crime born of necessity or desperation. Walters wasn't an innocent victim of circumstance. He was a cold, calculating predator who had carefully planned each kill with chilling precision. And the true horror wasn't just the murders themselves, but the twisted satisfaction he seemed to derive from them. As the final details of the case came to light, the question lingered. How could someone so seemingly harmless, someone who had managed to blend in so seamlessly with society, become a monster? How did the signs go unnoticed for so long? Was there something more, something deeper in his past that could have explained this behavior? Or was this just the tragic result of an uncontrollable urge that could never be satisfied? The authorities had their answers, but the public was left to ponder the same question. How could someone so ordinary, so unremarkable, have turned into something so monstrous? And perhaps more importantly, could there have been a way to stop this tragedy before it happened? Could anyone have seen the warning signs earlier? Could anyone have known what lay beneath the surface? In the end, the case of Daniel Walters left more questions than answers. His arrest brought some measure of closure to the victims' families, but the true scope of his actions and the motives behind them would never be fully understood. The police had done their job, but the public was left to grapple with the chilling reality that there are people who can slip through the cracks, unnoticed, until it's too late. What do you think? Could the clues have been uncovered sooner? Were there signs that were missed along the way? Could anyone have predicted what Walters would do next? If you found this case as unsettling as we did, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.